what type of business oh, sorry. A little,
Actually, I hate to do this to you. Do you mind, to everybody? But I realized I got so caught up with the delay, I forgot to press the record button. So if you wouldn't mind, Bill, just without doing the whole personal intro, maybe start with the company. Sorry, so sorry.
Not a problem. I think I was just getting through my retirement, so
Okay, good.
which lasted a month. So at that time, took about a month off. Realized that retirement wasn't for me, and but I took a lot of the learning lessons I had from my prior company, and two things were really important to me. I wanted to work with people that I really care about and really like. And that's endurance athletes. It's always been in my blood. And I also wanted to work with people that I really enjoy working with. So as we started early on in the early stages of the company, again, we're back and still in 2018, 19. One of the other shareholders introduced me to Oscar, who, at the beginning, I didn't really know him well, obviously, but as I got to know him more and more, I began to realize and also hear from other people that, Oscar is ultimately one of the most well-respected names and authorities in sports nutrition around the world. I'm going to embarrass him, but at some point, I'm going to want him to tell you a little bit about himself. He's extremely humble, but Oscar, I'm going to ask you, just for the sake of information, if you can, maybe tell the folks here a little bit about your background. So we started the company about 18 months ago. The goal of Neversecond has always been, since we started, is really been about bringing the same high quality sports nutrition products and guidance to everyday endurance athletes that a lot of the athletes, Oscar primarily works with world-class athletes, some of the best teams and athletes in the world. One of the things we always wanted to do is to bring this same level of high-level expertise and product quality to everyday endurance athletes. So without any further ado, I'd like to probably turn things over to Oscar. I think the plan for this call and the time that we have remaining, which is about 45 minutes, will be for Oscar to tell you a little bit about himself and his background. I think some of the basis of the Neversecond products, and then ultimately we'd like to talk about how you can leverage the products on next weekend. So Oscar, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. And I think at some stage we could, like now, we'll try to keep it pretty short and sweet. But at some point, if there is interest, then we can definitely do a longer version of this, and I can bring out the PowerPoints and explain things a little bit more. But my background is mostly academic. So I was a cyclist, also a runner and triathlete when I was very young, but mostly a cyclist. I grew up with like the guys that I trained with were professional cyclists. So I definitely had I had an interest in that sport, and I had to decide whether to take the sport professional or to go the academic route, which I chose to do. I studied exercise physiology. Then I did a PhD in a department that was very strong in nutrition. And if you combine exercise physiology and nutrition, you get something like sports nutrition. And that's what I focused on most of my career. Actually, more exercise nutrition, because part of my work was working with like less active people, and it was more in the diabetes field, and the other half was working with the other end of the spectrum, is the elite athletes. So I'm from Holland originally. So I studied in Holland at Maastricht University, which at the time was one of the top universities. The other top university at the time in this field was University of Texas in Austin. So I did a postdoc there for a year. And then I started a position at the University of Birmingham in the UK, which was an interesting university because it was the first sort of university in the UK that had a sports science degree. But they didn't have anything in sort of my area. So I chose it so that I could build up a lab from scratch. And so did that Started very, very small, but in a period of 10 years, that grew to the most productive sort of lab in the world in the field of exercise sciences. At the same time, so when you work in academia, it's all about doing research, being at the forefront of research, making sure that you're ahead of everyone else when it comes to trying to answer these questions. But for me, it was also about making sure that whatever the outcome of that research was, making sure that it lands with the athletes who you're doing the research for. And I think that's often the problem, that like great research happens everywhere, but the translation to, well, what does that mean for me on Sunday when I have to ride? That is often missing. And the research publications are difficult to read. And you can see this because the people that interpret it, often sort of journalists and various other people, they make mistakes in that translation. And therefore, this whole field of sports nutrition has become incredibly confusing. There's so many like opinions, and I don't think that the field is that confusing at all, because if you leave out all the nonsense, what is left is actually a pretty clear picture of what works and what doesn't work. So in like trying to translate the science to practice, I worked with a number of different athletes, like first maybe in cycling, but I also worked in many other sports, and sometimes you learn a lot from other sports, and like and you can then sort of implement some of those things in your own sport. What else? And in 2011, I decided to change. I had a lot of different sort of publications, and it was almost like, okay, are a few more publications really gonna make a difference? And I decided to change and move over to sort of what was seen as the dark side. So moved over to become the global senior director for the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. So Gatorade, based in Chicago, they have a sports science institute. They neglected it for a while, but that seriously damaged the credibility of Gatorade at the time, and so it was my task to bring it back. So set up the lab, grew a group there, or actually we built 5 different labs in different parts of the world, and the idea was mostly to, well, develop new products for the company, but also explain better, like, how do you use those products? And then with the athletes that Gatorade sponsored, like, work directly with them to help them. So it's a service model. And then after that, 2014, I started to work for myself. I've got a company now, a consulting company, My Sports Science. And with My Sports Science, I work with a lot of different athletes or teams or organizations. Examples are the Dutch Olympic Committee. So I'm head of nutrition for the Dutch Olympic team. So just come back from Tokyo. I work in cycling. I work with Jumbo-Visma. I've worked with Rabobank team way before, and it's essentially the same team. I've worked with Red Bull, where they have a number of soccer teams, one of them in New York, of course. And then they have 800 athletes all over the world in various sports. And yeah, there are a number of other clients, especially in soccer, that I work with. I've started a software company as well. That's interesting, maybe for today's chat. Is called Fuel the Core, which essentially tries to put nutrition advice into into software. So automate the whole process. But the latest adventure is this with Neversecond. because for me, it was very frustrating to see that there is all this knowledge. It doesn't always get translated to what athletes need. And product manufacturers often have the pressure of like almost listening to the athletes, because sometimes athletes think they know what they need, but that's not always the same as what the outcome of research is. And there are a number of examples. So a lot of manufacturers will add something to, like B vitamins is an example. You find that added to almost anything, even though there's very clear evidence that it doesn't do anything. If you don't need it, you need B vitamins, but you don't need it in the products that you take during a ride or during a marathon. That's just one example. But most product manufacturers will just put it in there just in case, and it helps the marketing. So we are more about like, what is it that you really need? And what is the best way to deliver that based on everything that we know? And that for me was like such a unique opportunity to sort of build these products really from nothing, and yeah, getting the opportunity to actually do that and then make the products the best possible products that you can make based on what we know, based on science, without any of the fluff or any of the stuff that you don't need. So that's the, it's a long version, but it is the short version of the
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd like to add is that, a lot of our products, especially on the fueling products that you're going to be using on your ride, the complex we use in them, just to give you a little bit of context, we use this 2-to-1 ratio of maltodextrin to fructose. We call it AJ21 carb blend. Interestingly enough, I mean, Oscar knows the story much better than me, but Oscar's the person who actually discovered this, and it's the current science used by many of the leading brands today. Oscar, maybe you'd like to touch base a little bit on how that research has come about and how athletes can leverage that, because ultimately that's really one of the most important bases for how we built the Neversecond C-Series product.
Yeah, this is one of those examples. So this research actually dates back to 2004. And in 2004, we knew that if you give someone a certain amount of carbohydrate, then they use some of that carbohydrate and the rest will just sit in the stomach or in the intestine. Now, if you give larger amounts, in theory, that should help. But the reality is that all you do is you just accumulate more carbohydrate in your gut, which that's not what you want. So we studied why that is the case. So why is it that, like, say you take 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour, your body will use a maximum of 60 grams of carbohydrate of that, which is like 2.5 gels from most brands, or 2 Neversecond gels. So why is that? So why can you not use the equivalent of 3 gels or 4 gels? And the reason is that the absorption in the intestine is the limiting factor. So you need to understand how absorption works to find a way around it. And the way around it is using different transporters in the intestine. So glucose, the most common carbohydrate, most common sugar that's used in sports drinks, is really limited to an uptake like no more than 60 grams per hour. That's really is the limit. But if you combine it with fructose, you can actually increase it way more. We showed that you can increase it like more than 200%. So that's not like, they're not marginal gains. That's massive. And we also, like, initially we studied like how much more carbohydrate you could use, and then we did studies looking at performance and how it changes performance. And in like probably the most important study what we did, we showed that a normal carbohydrate drink improves performance compared to just drinking water by about 8% if you do like a 3-hour effort. But if you take this glucose and fructose mix, it improves performance another 8% on top of that compared to your just normal, like traditional carbohydrate drink. Yeah. So these are not small. These are not small differences. Now, the difficulty is that in order to get the benefit, you actually need to take in quite a lot, probably quite a lot more than most people normally do. So if you just take small amounts, you're not going to get that additional benefit. You still get a benefit, but you don't get that additional benefit. So you need the larger amounts. If you get the larger amounts, the risk becomes much greater, because if you don't use the right products, it just accumulates in the intestine and it causes problems. And that's why it's important to have products that have the right composition, and that you get your intake right, you get the products right, and then it should be no problem at all.
I think that's been one of the most interesting things that we've seen with a lot of our athletes. So one of the things we do as a brand at Neversecond is to extensively test all of our products on athletes, and that pro athletes, mid-range athletes, sub-elite athletes. We're testing them on runners. Runners are historically some of the trickiest athletes to deal with, just because of the addition of the stomach jostling from running. And I think one of the things that we've really, I mean, Oscar's probably known all along that this was going to be something we could count on, but we routinely have seen with a lot of the athletes that we've dealt with, and whether it's triathletes, runners, cyclists, that there's a constant concern about GI upset, getting sick to their stomach, throwing up, nausea, and so forth from consuming larger volumes of carbohydrate. I think, Oscar, it might be interesting for you to maybe talk a little bit about how the idea of training the gut. I think a lot of our athletes right now are training their gut, and it'd be interesting to maybe talk real quickly about how athletes can reap the benefits of increasing their carbohydrate intake and training the gut.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the most interesting thing is to go back to professional cycling maybe 10 years ago. If you measured carbohydrate intake in those years in most of the teams, you would measure somewhere between 25 and 30 grams of carbohydrate per hour. That was the sort of the normal intake that they would have. Of course, there was variation. That was the sort of the average. So some would take in more towards recommendations that we have now, but that also means that some were taking even less. If we look at professional cycling now, I think almost any team would be taking something over 60 grams per hour. Some of the teams are pushing towards 120 grams an hour. So big differences. And you cannot just achieve that. So if you wanted to try this like in the next few days, I wouldn't go from what you're used to normally to 120 grams an hour. That is not the recommendation. But the interesting thing is that the gut can adapt really quickly and can adapt just like a muscle adapts. So if you, like, well, what I usually recommend is 1 day a week just dedicated to what I call nutritional training. And the purpose of that is really to train the gut, to make sure that the gut adapts to what you're going to ask it to do during your race. So ideally, you just go out on a longer training ride that is somewhat comparable to a race, and you have an intake of carbohydrate that also builds up to something that you want to do in the race. So if the goal would be, like the standard recommendation is 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. That would be sort of the very achievable target, I think, for the vast majority of people. 120 grams an hour is maybe that's only for a few, I think. So I would stick to, certainly in the beginning, to 90 grams per hour as the target. But if you're currently doing 30 grams in an hour, then that's not a step you make in 1 week. It's you probably need several weeks, I would say 6 to 10 weeks, to train the gut before you can actually tolerate that well and then actually use it without any problems whatsoever.
Oscar, question for you to that point. With a lot of the folks and not knowing everyone's background on the video here, what is your recommendation for someone who's coming into an event like this where they're riding anywhere between 50 to maybe 125 miles? I forget, I'm not sure if it's 125 or
That's
100.
the max. The max on this one is 125. We have about 20% of our people doing that, 25% doing the 100, and another 20 to 30% doing the 75, and then it's the smaller rides. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about the recommendations is, and this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, is that it's mostly duration dependent. So the advice we give is really, if it is between 2 and 3 hours, we say, well, you can get away with 60 grams an hour is fine. But if it is longer than 2.5 hours, you may benefit from 90 grams an hour. So anything over 2.5 hours could benefit from that. And this is true for the professional athletes all the way down to like the more recreational athlete. There is a little bit of a cutoff, like, because at some point, if the intensity is very low, the absolute intensity or the speed is very low, then it becomes just unnecessary to take that much. But for any, like most people that do 125 miles, that's pretty serious. So it's I think almost anyone there would benefit from that.
And it might be worthwhile just probably explaining our guidance system a little bit.
Yes.
For the folks, although I think one of the things that we really started to focus on early in the brand was, and it's something that Oscar's always felt very strongly about, is the need for athletes to understand. You know, you can offer a product to an athlete, but if you really can't guide them on how to use them or really how to perfect their nutrition, you know, some of the benefit can really be lost. And so, you know, one of the things that we've really worked on at Neversecond is to build a guidance system that would help everyday athletes all the way up to elite athletes plan and perfect their nutrition. So one of the, just to explain a little bit of the background that makes it challenging, if you look at a lot of the different nutrition products on the market, if you take a gel as an example, take a goo gel or like an SIS gel as an example, a lot of these products have arbitrary values of carbohydrate. And so if, for instance, the guideline, as Oscar's been discussing, is to hit 90 grams an hour, how do you do that when a gel has 22 grams of carbohydrate? And then you may have some sport drink mix and you may have some sips of it and you have another 14 grams in there. So what becomes increasingly difficult for the athlete is to really understand what they actually consumed during effort. So if they're going out if they're in a 3-hour race and they're supposed to consume 270 grams of carbohydrate during that race, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to know that. You know, and also it becomes even more challenging is when they're training, you know, since we've been talking about training the gut and the idea about perfecting, really understanding the numbers really do matter when you want to start to really understand how you perform relative to what you're taking in. And so what we've developed at Neversecond, and we are launching other ranges of products, but in our fueling products, which we call our C-Series products, are all marked by using a unique dot system. I have just a box here just to give you an example, but this is probably worth showing. So when you look at a C-Series product, you'll notice that all of them are labeled with the carbohydrate value. So for instance, this is a C30 product. That means that every serving contains 30 grams of carbohydrate. We also use a dot system or a Neversecond unit where every dot equals 30 grams. All of our products are developed with exact, precise 30-gram increments of carbohydrate. This allows athletes to plan. So for instance, if you're going out for a 3-hour ride and you need to consume, for instance, 270 grams of carbohydrate, we would say, well, 270 would be 9 Neversecond units. And then, so the athlete would then be able to, for instance, grab any of the C series products that would provide them 9 units. So, and I think what's really nice is the line, all of our products aren't fully developed yet. We have a pipeline of products that we're developing in the C series grouping. But what we're working toward is being able to offer athletes liquid. So you'd have like sports drink, gel, which would be kind of like a gel consistency, all the way up to solid food that are all C series products that you can then mix and match to land at your number. So if you need 9 Neversecond units, you can simply count up the dots, whether it's a bar, a gel, or a sports drink mix. As long as you add up to those 9 units, you're good to go. With that said, it's probably worth talking a little bit about hydration. I know a lot of you probably, 2 of the items that we're supplying to the riders for this event are our gels, as well as our sports drink mix. Both of those products are C series, C30 products rather. It might be worth having Oscar touch base because I think there's always a lot of confusion between hydration and fueling. We treat them independently at Neversecond, but I figured it'd be good for you just to talk a little bit about hydration and how you think about hydration when we're talking about an overall fueling strategy.
Yeah, I think maybe first before we get to that question, maybe it's also important to talk about how normally you pick up a sports drink and you look on the label, or you look at the claims, and it's usually it has claims about hydration and how it speeds up hydration, and it then tells you it's backed up by evidence, and usually that's true. So there is usually evidence to back up that actually really helps hydration. But then now you use that product in a real life event, and you take the drink, and then a little bit later you have a bar, and then a little bit later you have a gel, and all of those products have a particular claim on it. But actually what happens when you throw it all together in your stomach and you mix it, then actually none of those claims are valid anymore, because the reason why the sports drink was so good and would help hydration, you've now killed that by adding your carbohydrate or bar, for example. And the carbohydrate bar had a claim on how effective it is in delivering energy. Well, actually, by combining it with the sports drink, it may not be effective anymore. So what we've done is make sure that whatever product you choose, you can always just throw them in your stomach and mix them. It's not a problem. So it's true what Bill says. It's like whether it's the drink or the gel or the bar, you'll be able to mix everything in your stomach, and all the claims will still be valid. So I think that's the main sort of take home message, I think. So in terms of hydration and fuel and carbohydrate, they are 2 quite separate needs. So if you look at the advice, it is basically maybe I can just share my screen really quickly. Then it's a little bit easier to explain here. Yeah, you can see this graph now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is excellent. Thank you for adding this. Wonderful.
Yeah, so on the horizontal axis here, you see like 0, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And this is the carbohydrate recommendation. You can see that as the duration increases, the recommendation also increases. And it's divided up into like 30 grams an hour, 60 grams an hour, and 90 grams an hour. So if it's between 1 and 2 hours, it's 30 grams an hour, between 2 and 3, 60. And really from 2.5 hours, you could start to see benefits of taking as much as 90 grams per hour. It also shows here if it's less than 1 hour, there really is no need. So that's also maybe not so important for cyclists because it doesn't happen so often, but it's definitely important that here there's very little benefit that you can expect. So this is really, and these are published recommendations. So these are published by the American College of Sports Medicine, by the IOC. So this is generally accepted. And this is also why we chose to have 30, 60, and 90. So they're not just random numbers that we picked. So these are the carbohydrate recommendations. Now, the fluid recommendations are a bit different because fluid recommendations are tricky because everyone sweats really differently. Like we all know people that sweat bucket loads, and then other people who never seem to sweat at all. So it's incredibly individual. So on the one hand, we have these carbohydrate recommendations that are pretty generic. I mean, this is true for almost any person. But then we have the fluid recommendations where you really like to give a meaningful amount of fluid, you need to know how much someone is sweating. And the recommendation there is to really measure how much someone is sweating. And it's actually quite easy to do. All you need is a scale before and after training and correcting for your intake, and you can get a pretty good idea of how much you sweat. And if you do that regularly in different conditions, you can really start to predict what your sweat rate is. So this is the stuff that we do with the professional cyclists. So we have hundreds of measurements of them, and we can really accurately predict how much they're going to sweat on a particular stage in certain conditions, and certain expectations of what that race is going to look like. So to make it a little bit simpler, because not everyone will have done these sweat measurements, you can estimate them to a pretty good degree. But maybe the easiest is to do a couple of sweat measurements in comparable conditions and get your answers from that. If you're not sure, then I would recommend to use the tool that I mentioned, Fuel the Core, which is you can use a free version of that, and it helps you to calculate or estimate your sweat rate.
Oscar, does weight of rider have any bearing on carbohydrate consumption, or is it roughly the same regardless of the size of the athlete?
Yeah, it's completely the same. So this is another like thing that is pretty counterintuitive. You would expect like someone who's a very large, who's got a very large frame and produces enormous amounts of power would need more. And maybe it's true they would need more, but they have the same GI tract, the same gut with the same limitations, and that's why the recommendations are not different. So we've actually done a paper on the runner behind me, Haile Gebrselassie, who was probably the first runner to take 90 grams an hour during a marathon, and he ran a world record. But we did a paper on how like these very small Ethiopian and very light Ethiopian and Kenyan runners have this huge advantage over heavier runners, because relatively speaking, they can fuel much more, right? If you express 90 grams an hour compared to their body weight, compared to the average body weight, they're getting much more energy from outside than the heavier runner. And same is true for cycling. So body weight has no effect on carbohydrate needs. It will affect fluid needs probably because it's more likely that if you have more muscle, you engage more muscle, you produce more heat, you sweat more, and thus you need to drink more.
So if I could throw in, we had Mike ask a question that I think is good, and I want to encourage everybody, if you have any questions, rather than have a Q&A session with everyone coming on with their mic, if you could put it in the chat. Mike was asking, so if you're supposed to take 90 grams an hour, would you take a gel every 20 minutes to get that 90 grams, or would you take it at the beginning of the hour? And is the ingestion, rate an interesting topic to hear a bit about?
Yeah, there's the ingestion rate has some influence, but it's relatively small. So I would do whatever is practical. So in the professional cyclists that I work with, we sort of identify before the stage what are the moments where they can eat, because often, like in downhills or in mountain climbs, it's just really difficult. But there are certain phases of the race where they can do it. But if you in a sportive, or if you're just riding, and you can do this. I would go for every 20 minutes and just be really sort of regular with that. With gels, if you use gels, it's you can't do half gels. So you can do every 10 minutes, and so every 20 minutes is also much more practical. And I wouldn't do like everything in one go. So that's the research also shows that if you take a larger amount once an hour, it's slightly less effective than doing every 20 minutes. So yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
I was going to say we have about 10 more minutes. So it'd be good to see if anyone had any additional questions for us.
Yeah.
You could also come off mute if you prefer not to type. If anybody wants to raise a question. So I'm curious, why not share with us a little bit of your recent success? I mean, I know I could ask Mike to share who he knows you've been fueling, but go ahead and pat yourselves a little bit on the back for some of the winners that you're working with. Please.
I mean, in terms of the athletes we're working with right now, 2 cycling teams that we are the exclusive performance nutrition supplier for EF Education First, which as well as for Team Bahrain Victorious. They're both, I guess, well, from the Tour de France, they were the #1 and #2 team. We are working, they both started implementing our products, right before the tour. So generally speaking, it's definitely from not only from a performance perspective, but also from just a likability perspective. The athletes definitely really enjoyed our products. We work with on the several triathletes, both European and US. I was going to say, we work with both some Olympic as well as half Ironman and Ironman specialists. I mean, each of these athletes by themselves is safe to say they're already really talented and doing really well. But we've really enjoyed watching them this year. They've had some phenomenal success. We've had quite a few wins, which I think has been really special. I think one of the things we're also doing for a lot of our athletes is we're working one-on-one, helping them do their performance nutrition better. What I think Oscar would agree with, and it's been interesting for me to observe, is even at the elite level, some athletes just disregard the value of the nutrition component. And some of them have amazing performances regardless. And so we always have to ask ourselves the question, well, how would they have done if they were doing the nutrition component right? And so, but we definitely have had some great success with some, again, the cycling teams. We're also working with several runners as well. Working with Jordan Hasse, who's, 220 American marathoner. She's run the 3rd fastest US American women's time. And then we're working with Sondra Moen, who's sub 206 Norwegian marathoner as well. We are fairly new, and we're starting to, obviously work with additional athletes that are coming on board. I think one of the things that we do really well is, focus on the product quality, and the feedback we've gotten has been pretty tremendous from the athletes who are using our product. We do have in the pipeline, I think it's also worth mentioning, right now at the event on next weekend, we've got just our C30 sports drink and our C30 gels, energy gels. We are launching several new products over the winter. We're offering some recovery products, which I think will be really well received by a lot of athletes. We're also in the process of launching a C90 carbohydrate, high carb sports drink mix, which is 90 grams of carbohydrate per serving. That is launching in about another 2 or 3 weeks. So that we're really excited about that product. A lot of our long course triathletes, athletes that are competing in especially long events for sure, are really loving that product.
So I just want to, before I ask some of the questions that are in the window there, I just want to say we have a growing number of riders on this ride. It's true to form that a lot of the riders tend to register in the last week or two. And so we have 5 rest stops over the 5 or 6 rest stops over the 125-mile potential routes, right? So we have thought about putting your product out in the locations where the 7,500 and 125 milers who will need the boost. I guess that's really, we're talking about towards the middle of their riding experience. So they won't have it in the first stop in about 20 miles in, and they won't have it at the last stop, 13 miles left. I guess are we doing it the right way, splitting it sort of roughly a third then, so people can take it in each location and kind of replenish?
I think so. Yeah, that's what I would do. So.
Okay, that's good. I just needed that bit of advice. So one of the questions is, do you have any basic recommendations on, this is Joan's question, on hydration, with a follow-up of any thoughts on what to eat the day before? So
so the hydration question is tough because of course I can give very generic recommendations and say you need, say, 24 ounce per hour, but then you have people who need twice that, and you have people who need less than half that. So it's really difficult without knowing whether someone is a heavy sweater or not, what that would be. But that at least gives you the range of what you would expect. Normally what I would say, the important thing is that when you finish, you don't need to be at the same weight as at the start. It is okay to lose a bit of weight, to lose maybe 6-7 pounds is absolutely no problem. If it's really hot, and this is also the messaging has been a bit different, I think, from different companies, and so where it's like people have been pushed so much to hydrate and almost make sure that you finish with the same weight, or more is better. That's not necessarily the case. So you do want to lose some fluid on the ride, and that is okay. So yeah, it's really difficult to give a meaningful number without knowing whether you sweat a lot or sweat a little, but hopefully by giving you that range, it gives you some idea, and hopefully where on that range you would sit.
So a heavy sweater would be at the higher end, and obviously a low sweater at the lower end. How would you recommend fueling in the morning of the event? So we're going to be light at our launch point. Our goal is to get people out on the road. So we're going to tell them to come to the event having had their initial sustenance. What do you recommend they do at that point?
Yeah, so I'll take that with the other question about what to eat the day before, because the day before is equally as important. So the day before, you make sure that your muscle glycogen stores are full. That's essentially your most important tank for the day. That needs to be full. That doesn't mean that you have to overeat the day before. It just means you have to focus on carbohydrate intake. So don't overeat. You don't want to be extra heavy at the start. You just want to be fueled at the start. So focus on carbohydrate. I would also, depending on the intensity, but if the race is pretty intense, or the event is pretty intense, I would have the main meal at lunchtime the day before, and the evening meal already a little bit lighter. Then on the morning before, you wake up and your muscle glycogen stores are still completely full. So nothing has happened to them. So if you've eaten well the day before, they're still perfectly intact. But that's not the case for your liver glycogen. That's another store that is important. You need your liver glycogen to maintain a normal blood glucose level. If your blood glucose drops, this is when you start to get sort of the lightheadedness and the dizziness, and suddenly your power is all gone. And so it is important in the morning to top up the liver glycogen. Now, you don't need like a ridiculously large breakfast to do that, but again, you need to find a form of carbohydrate that you tolerate really well. And it's not possible to give very generic advice, because especially breakfast is very individual. People usually eat the same thing, like almost every day. The breakfast is one of the meals that changes the least. Like, people don't really like change their breakfast a lot. They like to eat the same things. And that is good, because that means that you're used to that, and that's what you should do before the event. And then in terms of fueling, I think the hour before is important as well. And it is okay to eat something in the hour before, but if you have experienced sort of lightheadedness in the first half hour of an event, then I would not do that, and I would just start maybe 10 minutes before, and then take a gel or take a banana or take something in the 10 minutes before. But then avoid eating in the hour before.
I'm glad to hear you say banana, because that's actually what we plan to have at Sakura at the beginning point of the road. I do want to just also say that, as we often remind our riders, that this is a ride, not a race. Although people who have signed up to do 100 and 125 are going to want to get back in time to have our wonderfully catered recovery meal. And so they might need to go at race speeds in order to do that, because we'll be shutting down the cutoffs at certain points. So all points very well taken, because we do have some riders who are going to need to make some serious movement. Any other questions? Anybody else want to ask? I want to be mindful of our time here. And I can't thank you guys enough, because I think we have a good fit here. And I'm looking forward to our racing team having a chance to experience. They'll be the first ones getting, I presume, to these further locations. And so we'll get you some feedback from them on how they found it. I mean, if they don't call you, that'll tell you something, but I have a hunch they'll be calling you guys. So any other questions? And I got to bring back the, here we go. We're getting some thanks. Thank you all for coming to the ride. And I just want to also let people know this is our new jersey. And if you ordered it before a certain date at the end of July, you'll be able to pick it up at the ride. But we're going to be selling this jersey until October 1st, and then we'll fulfill by holiday season. So I think that's really it, unless you guys want to add anything else. I really appreciate you, and I wish you every success. It seems like you're going to have it, so that's good.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate your time, and if you have any questions, don't ever hesitate. Alan can probably reach you more easily than I can, but I'll provide Alan our email, so you can always email me offline if you have any questions.
All right.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, all of us. Good night over in the UK.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.